Hello, Alan Bradshaw here of Work-Life Solutions. What follows is an interview I conducted with Emma Donaldson-Fielder, who is the chartered psychologist who led the research into stress management competencies. Now, stress management competencies, essentially, they're the skills and behaviours line managers need to prevent and reduce stress at work. And this four-year research programme was funded by the Health and Safety Executive, CIPD and Investors in People. And it led to the development of something called a management competency framework, assessment tools and a management development intervention that organisations can use to upskill line managers. I'm sure you'll find the interview extremely interesting, and I look forward to hearing on the website, or more particularly on our blog, what you thought. Thanks, and here goes the interview. Well, Emma, I've got a few questions for you about the research. First of all, how did the research into the stress management competencies come about?
Well, basically, the Health and Safety Executive had recently issued management standards which gave guidance to organisations on how to prevent and reduce stress in the workplace. But my evidence, both from research and my own practice, suggested that those standards in order to achieve those standards, the key thing was to look at how people were being managed on a day-to-day basis. So how line managers were treating their team and their employees. So I was talking a lot to the Health and Safety Executive about that and saying that, and eventually they decided that that was absolutely right, and they started to fund the research to look at exactly what manager behaviours were important in that context.
Okay, so what was really different about this approach was this emphasis on line managers and their behaviour.
Exactly. So while the management standards are very good for giving organisations overall guidance on what factors are important in terms of job design and the way the organisation functions, actually you need something that's a bit finer grain, if you like, that is very specifically about management behaviour, and that's where the management competencies come in. The idea is it's giving clear guidance on very specific actions and behaviours that managers need to either show or avoid showing in order to prevent and reduce stress.
Okay, that's great. What sort of processes did you and your research colleagues follow to gather data about manager behaviours?
Well, we started off interviewing both employees about what they had experienced in terms of the way their manager had behaved, and also managers talking about how they specifically had handled situations when their team was under pressure and what they had done to prevent stress, or conversely, how they might have contributed to making that worse. So it was very much gathering the views from both sides, if you like.
Right.
And then we followed that up with, once we got all the interview data and come up with an initial framework, we then used a questionnaire survey, again asking both managers and employees their opinions. And throughout that process, we were also in dialogue with other relevant practitioners. So that's people like HR managers, health and safety practitioners, occupational health practitioners, those sorts of people who and got their views and input as well.
So that was really sort of both qualitative and quantitative research.
Exactly, yes.
About how many sort of people, organisations, managers and staff took part in the early phases of the research?
Well, we interviewed nearly 400 managers and employees in terms of the qualitative data, and then the questionnaire survey, we got responses from over 800 managers and employees. So it went pretty broadly, and I think we had somewhat in excess of 20 different organisations participating.
Right, that's great. Can you briefly talk us through, Emma, what came out of the early research phases 1 and 2?
So the initial phase, the qualitative phase, produced a framework of behavioural themes, and that initial framework actually had 19 different themes to it, covering the different types of manager behaviour. The second phase refined that framework down using quantitative analysis, and so the refined framework came up with 4 broad themes, which were each split into 3 sub-themes. So that the overall broad themes were about being respectful and responsible, which is around managing emotions and having integrity. Secondly, about managing and communicating existing and future work. Thirdly, about managing the individual within the team. And fourthly, about reasoning and managing difficult situations. So those 4 broad themes, and then associated explanations were what came out of at the end of the second phase.
Okay.
And also a questionnaire. As part of that process, we developed a questionnaire with 66 questions covering all 4 of those themes.
Okay, is that the stress management competencies indicator tool?
Exactly, yes.
Right, okay, that's great. In the third phase, you developed and tested an intervention for line managers. Could you briefly explain the stages of the intervention and why the intervention took the shape that it did?
Yes, so the first part of the intervention was to get the managers involved and a good sample of their staff, so at least 3 members of each manager's team, to fill in the questionnaire, the Stress Management Competencies Indicator tool. And what that enabled us to do was not only to have our own measure, if you like, benchmark of how managers were perceived before the intervention. It also allowed us to then develop a feedback report. So each manager who participated, provided they and 3 of their team filled in the questionnaire, were provided with a report which looked at and showed them how their behaviour was perceived on each of the 66 indicators. So basically it was giving the manager upward feedback about how their behaviour was perceived by their team and comparing that with how the manager perceived their own behaviour.
So that's kind of 360 type approach then.
Yes, it doesn't have the full 360 because it was just direct reports on the individual themselves, not the manager and their peers. But it's certainly giving them that feedback from others. So that was the initial step, and then after that, the managers all participated in a workshop to help them understand their own feedback. But also to help them understand the different behaviours and why they were relevant and what was important, and to think about how they needed to develop their own management repertoire. So looking at, for example, what were they already doing and doing well, and how could they continue to do that? What things might they need to stop doing if they're doing any of the things that are unhelpful, and what kind of things do they need to start doing? So what sort of behaviours are in the framework that the manager is not currently perceived to be showing. So it was really about getting managers to get an understanding of what behaviours are important and how they needed to potentially develop their management repertoire in order to show the relevant behaviours. And then we then did a further upward feedback process afterwards to see whether behaviour had changed or not.
Right, that's great. So, how did when you sort of looked at your results, how did this kind of approach benefit the managers who took part, and did you find any benefits to the organisation and to staff in general?
The key benefit, I think, was that managers were able to change their behaviour, and that was particularly the case for those managers who weren't showing the stress management competencies before the start. So those managers who got poor scores, if you like, on the upward feedback initially, were able to understand where they were not showing appropriate behaviours and were able to actually make those changes and got more positive scores after they'd been through the intervention. So that was a key thing. I think it was particularly about raising awareness. I think that was a very important part of this. And raising understanding, and by doing that, helping them make shifts and change behaviour. In terms of the benefits for the organisation, that's a research exercise still to be done in terms of gathering hard data. But what we do know is that where managers show these behaviours, that they tend to have employees with better well-being. So the advantage to both those being managed by these individuals and to the organisation as a whole is that you will see better employee well-being, and hopefully that will then lead to better performance in the long run.
Yeah. So one of the major things that came out of that then was that that this benefited most the managers with the greatest development needs.
Exactly.
Okay, that's great. What would you say were the main applications of the stress management competencies approach?
Well, I think the most obvious application would be in a learning and development context. So the fact that we've shown that by giving upward feedback and running workshops, you can actually support managers to change their behaviour means that can be rolled out in organisations, across the country, really, and you can actually help managers to make those changes. I think it could be rolled out in a coaching context as well as in a sort of training workshop context. So there's flexibility about how you might use it in a learning and development context. But I think in the longer run, you could actually use this framework in other ways. So in other ways that might help shift manager behaviour through, for example, giving them the framework as part of an appraisal process or in performance management. So actually measuring managers' behaviour over a longer period and supporting them to behave, rewarding them for behaving in these ways.
Yeah.
You could also use it in a recruitment context as part of a selection and assessment process when you're either promoting managers within the organisation, or if you're recruiting from people from outside the organisation. So you could use it as a way of measuring whether an individual is a suitable person to put in a management position.
Yes, so it could be really useful, both for existing managers, but also potential managers.
Yes.
Or even potentially, I guess, aspiring managers. Where the use of a framework like this, you've got some tools that you can assess those behaviours.
Exactly, and you can support people who are hoping to move into management positions through learning and development to make sure that by the time they get that promotion, if you like, that they're in a good position to manage in ways that are healthy and prevent stress.
Yeah, no, that's good. When you were sort of going through the research program, what sorts of potential barriers did you find to this approach, and how might they be overcome?
I think one of the big barriers is when either the senior management within an organisation or the managers themselves don't want to engage with these kinds of issues. And I think one of the big things here is really about how you convince managers throughout the hierarchy, if you like, that the prevention of stress and improving employee well-being is actually good for them and good for the business, as well as being good for the individuals. So there's something about what's in it for the business, what's in it for the manager, and looking at, for example, links between well-being and performance, and showing how actually these are things that will have an impact on productivity in the long run is quite important. And I think a lot of organisations think that investing in well-being or stress prevention is going to be costly. And one of the important things about this is that we're not saying you have to do X, Y, and Z extra activities or lay on extra programs. It's really about shifting management from being the type of management behaviour that is bad for people, those being managed, to management behaviour that is actually good for well-being and good for preventing stress. So it's about making shifts in day-to-day management behaviour rather than a whole extra range of activities that need to be taken on.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Emma. That's a really good a really good overview of the stress management competencies approach, and thanks for answering all my questions.
My pleasure.
Thank you.